Luciana squeezed the coins in her hand, feeling the cold metal against her skin. She looked at the shelves of the market where she worked, mentally reviewing the cheapest products she could afford. 5 pesos. That was all she had. Just enough for a small package of rice or maybe 2-day-old breads. And tomorrow? That question haunted her like an unyielding shadow. From the other side of the counter, Ricardo, the manager, watched her with a mixture of discomfort and pity. He knew Luciana was going through hard times, but he was just another employee, someone who had to follow orders. The market had reinforced its zero-tolerance policy, and he had already given her more advances than allowed. "Luciana, you know I can't do anything else for you," he murmured, as if it pained him to say those words. At home, Sofia and Clara waited for their mother with empty stomachs, but without complaint. Sofia, though older by a few minutes, always tried to appear strong and calm for her sister. Clara, more fragile, avoided asking about dinner, but her gaze said it all. Luciana felt a lump in her throat. How could she explain to a child that a mother's love is not enough to fill a plate? Motherhood carried a weight that grew more unbearable every day. As she left the market with only a package of cookies in her bag, her eyes fixed on the posters on the wall. Zero tolerance. Any theft will be severely punished. She swallowed hard. She had never taken anything that wasn't hers. But what if one day she had no choice? What if desperation pushed her to the limit? That night, the house was in semi-darkness. The light bulb on the ceiling flickered weakly, as if it too were tired of fighting the darkness. Sofia and Clara sat together on the old mattress on the floor, huddling under a thin blanket that barely kept out the cold. Luciana broke the silence with a forced smile and set the package of cookies on the table. "Today we have a special dinner," she said with an enthusiasm she did not feel. But the girls were not fools. They knew their mother was suffering, even if she tried to hide it behind cheerful words. Clara took a cookie with trembling hands and broke it in 2, offering half to her sister. That small gesture contained more love than any lavish feast. Sofia accepted without protest, even though her stomach begged her to devour it all. Luciana watched the scene with a tightness in her chest, fighting back tears. What mother feels proud to see her daughters sharing crumbs? But instead of crying, she took a deep breath and sat beside them, hugging them with the strength of someone who has nothing else to give. The clock on the wall struck 10 at night when rain began to pound furiously on the roof. A leak in the corner of the room formed a puddle on the floor, reflecting Luciana's face when she lowered her gaze. Every falling drop was a reminder of all she could not provide. She had asked for help everywhere, tried to find another job, but the market was all she had. She knew she couldn't go on like this much longer. The rent was overdue, the fridge empty, and the bills were piling up like a mountain too high to climb. Sofia, in her small voice, interrupted her mother's thoughts. "Mommy, what will we do if we can't live here anymore?" The question hit Luciana's chest like a punch. She did not want her daughters to feel afraid, but she also couldn't lie to them. She stroked their hair, and with the firmest voice she could muster, answered, "Don't worry, my loves, we'll always find a way." But deep down, she had no idea what that way might be. She only knew she couldn't afford to give up. The next morning, Luciana woke up with a weight on her chest. It wasn't just the cold of the room or the hardness of the floor where she had slept, but the anguish of knowing another difficult day had begun. There was no milk, no bread, just a couple of broken cookies in the bag. She looked at her daughters still asleep and decided to leave early. Maybe if she got to the market sooner, she could convince Ricardo to give her a little more time to pay her debt. The way to work was full of sale posters announcing discounts on products she could never afford. It was ironic how abundance was always within sight, but never within her reach. Passing by a bakery, the smell of freshly baked bread churned her empty stomach. She clenched her fists and walked faster, reminding herself she had to be strong. She could not afford to falter, not when her daughters depended on her. When she arrived at the market, she immediately noticed a change in the atmosphere. The employees whispered among themselves, their expressions tense. On the wall, next to the punch clock, was a new notice. Starting today, any attempt of theft will be reported without exceptions. Cameras installed in every aisle. A chill ran down Luciana's spine. She knew that decision had a clear objective: to expose those who, like her, struggled to keep from falling into despair. Ricardo called her into his office and closed the door behind her. He looked uneasy, as if the conversation he was about to have weighed on him more than usual. "Luciana, they've tightened the rules. I tried talking to the owner, but there was no way." She looked at him without speaking, expecting the inevitable. "I can't give you any more advances. I'm sorry." The words echoed cruelly in her mind. She felt the ground disappear beneath her feet, but she remained composed. She couldn't afford to cry. Luciana left the office feeling an even heavier burden on her shoulders than when she went in. She had not expected a different response, but part of her still held onto the hope of getting a little more time. Now, with the certainty that there would be no more help, she had to find a solution on her own. Her daughters could not wait. They could not understand about bureaucracy or unjust rules. They only knew they were hungry. She spent the rest of the day on autopilot, restocking shelves and waiting on customers with a smile she didn't feel. The whispers around her made her feel small, as if everyone knew about her situation. Some co-workers looked at her with pity, others with indifference, and some simply avoided her. In a world where everyone fights for their own survival, someone else's misfortune is rarely a priority. When the clock struck quitting time, Luciana felt relief and fear at the same time. Relief because she wouldn't have to pretend she was okay anymore. Fear because outside the same reality as always awaited: an empty house and two hungry girls. She walked to the back of the market to leave her apron, and that was when her eyes settled on something she had never before considered. Next to the garbage containers, there were boxes full of expired products. Bread, fruits, vegetables, all still in good condition, but discarded because they didn't meet the market's quality. Luciana's stomach growled loudly at the sight of that wasted food. She thought about her daughters, about how they could have something more than cookies for dinner if she just took some of it. She looked around. No one was watching. Was it wrong to feed her daughters with what others considered trash? Luciana stood still for a moment, her breath ragged and her heart pounding in her chest. Her hands trembled as she approached the boxes, as if simply looking at that waste was a crime. She felt her conscience split between need and fear. Her daughters waited at home, and there in front of her was enough food to give them a decent dinner. But the market's rules were clear. How far could a mother go to protect her children without crossing a dangerous line? With a swift movement, she grabbed a bag of bread that was barely expired the day before. It wasn't stealing. She wasn't taking anything from anyone. She was just going to take what would end up in the trash anyway. She repeated those words in her mind, trying to convince herself she wasn't doing anything wrong. But as she hid the bread inside her bag, a chill ran down her spine. Something inside her told her this would not end well. A rumble of thunder in the distance made her react. It was late. She had to leave before anyone saw her. She hurried down the wet street, clutching the bag to her chest. Each step made her feel guiltier, more anxious. She wasn't a thief, but desperation has a strange way of driving people to do things they never imagined. Her mind kept repeating the same question: what if they found out? When she got home, her daughters ran to hug her joyfully. "Mommy, do we have dinner today?" Clara asked, hope shining in her eyes. Luciana closed her eyes for a moment, trying to hold back tears. She crouched down to hug them tightly and, with a trembling smile, whispered, "Yes, sweethearts. Tonight we have dinner together." But deep down, something told her that happiness would be short-lived. Dawn brought with it a false sense of calm. Luciana woke up with the first rays of light filtering through the tattered curtains of the window. For the first time in a long while, her daughters had not gone to bed with empty stomachs. Still, the peace did not last. As she got Sophia and Clara ready for school, the thought of the previous night tormented her. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. At the market, the atmosphere felt different. There was tension in the air, and her co-workers looked at her with curiosity, some even with suspicion. Luciana tried to ignore it, focusing on her daily tasks. But she couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. Ricardo called her into his office, his tone more serious than usual. "I need you to tell me the truth, Luciana." She felt her stomach tighten. Ricardo slid an envelope across the table. They were black and white photos taken by security cameras. In them, her figure was clearly visible next to the market's trash containers, her bag open. The image froze the exact moment when her hands took the expired bread. Luciana felt the world crumble beneath her feet. She tried to speak, but the words drowned in her throat. "I didn't do it for myself. My daughters..." Before she could explain, the office door burst open. Regina, the market owner, walked in with a firm step, her gaze sharp like a blade. "So this is the ungrateful one who's been stealing from us," she said, her voice echoing like a verdict. Luciana wanted to protest, wanted to explain she had only taken what was already trash, but she knew no excuse would be enough for someone like Regina. Luciana felt her legs weaken under the weight of Regina's cold stare. She was a woman of imposing presence, perfectly made up and with an expression of absolute superiority. She didn't see Luciana as a person, but as an insect she had just caught in her trap. "I've been far too generous with employees like you, people who only know how to bite the hand that feeds them." Humiliation burned in Luciana's chest, but she couldn't afford to respond. Ricardo looked away, uncomfortable. He seemed torn between loyalty to his boss and the compassion he felt for Luciana. "I don't think this is necessary. She only took what we were going to throw away," he murmured weakly in her defense. But Regina didn't even look at him. For her, the only justice that mattered was that which kept her reputation intact. The rules are clear. Theft is theft, no matter the amount. We can't make exceptions. Luciana opened her mouth to protest, but before she could say a word, Regina took out her phone and dialed a number with firm fingers. Market security arrived within minutes, two burly men who surrounded her as if they were apprehending a dangerous criminal. "Call the police. I want everything done by the book." The tone of her voice made it clear she had already passed judgment. It didn't matter what Luciana said, her fate was decided. Market customers began to watch the scene with curiosity. Word of what was happening spread in seconds. Some employees looked on in surprise, others in indifference. But no one, absolutely no one, stepped forward to defend her. Luciana felt a knot in her throat, not because of the accusation, not because of the shame, but because at that moment she realized no one would help her. Luciana felt the air grow heavy around her. The customers' and employees' gazes cut through her like invisible blades, some full of judgment, others just morbid curiosity. Her hands trembled as the guards surrounded her, as if she truly were a criminal. She wanted to shout, to explain she hadn't stolen anything, that she'd only taken what was going to be thrown out, but she knew those words meant nothing to Regina. Justice isn't always about truth, but about power. One of the guards spoke into his radio, reporting that the police were on their way. Luciana's legs threatened to give way, but she forced herself to stand. She couldn't afford to look weak, even though inside she felt she was falling apart. Regina crossed her arms impatiently, regarding her with a mocking smile. "I hope you enjoy your stay in jail. There you'll learn what real punishment is." Her voice dripped with cruelty. Ricardo, still standing in his office doorway, lowered his gaze in shame. Luciana felt anger toward him, unable to utter a single word in her defense. She knew deep down that he didn't agree with what was happening, but his fear was stronger than his morals. And in a world where people fear losing the little they have, injustice always finds room to grow. She clenched her fists, not out of rage, but out of impotence. She knew she had no chance of escaping unscathed from this situation. The sound of sirens in the distance made her entire body tense. It was as if her fate was sealed at that very moment, as if the handcuffs were already closing around her wrists. She thought of Sophia and Clara, of their little faces waiting at home, of their voices calling out with hope. They wouldn't understand what was happening. They wouldn't understand why their mother wasn't coming home that night. And worst of all, no one, absolutely no one, would do anything to stop it. The blue and red lights of the patrol car lit up the market entrance, reflecting on the faces of onlookers still watching the scene. Luciana felt her heart pounding against her chest, as if trying to warn her of the worst to come. When the officers got out of the car, walking authoritatively toward her, she knew there was no escape. Her destiny was being written at that very moment, without anyone giving her the chance to defend herself. One of the police officers, a man with a weary face, looked at Regina with the respect reserved for those in power. "They told us there was a theft at the establishment. Do you have proof?" Regina smiled smugly and pointed to Ricardo, who, with trembling hands, gave them the security camera photos. The images showed Luciana by the trash containers, holding the bread in both hands. There was no context, no explanation, just a story crafted so all the blame would fall squarely on her. Luciana tried to speak, but her voice broke before she could form a complete sentence. Her words stuck in her throat, blocked by anguish and fear. She looked at Ricardo one last time, searching his gaze for a spark of compassion, but he only looked away. Maybe he knew what they were doing was wrong, but he wasn't willing to risk his own job for her. "It wasn't like that. She tried to say, but Regina interrupted with a wave of her hand. "That's enough, do your job." The order sounded like a shot. One of the police officers took out his handcuffs and in a quick mechanical motion clasped them around Luciana's wrists, chaining her as if she were a dangerous criminal. The cold metal burned her skin, not just from its temperature, but from the humiliation it represented. The last time she had felt that kind of despair was the day the father of her daughters abandoned them without looking back. But this time, it wasn't just emotional pain. It was her freedom being taken away. The cold metal of the cuffs cut off her circulation, but the real pain did not come from the iron. It came from the humiliation of being treated like a criminal. Luciana lowered her gaze, feeling that any attempt to defend herself would be futile. Nobody would listen, nobody wanted to. For everyone at the market, her fate was already sealed, and the voice of a poor woman never carries more weight than that of someone powerful. Outside, a crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, watching with looks of surprise and murmurs of speculation. Some recorded with their phones, others merely watched with the indifference of those who view someone else's misfortune as entertainment. Luciana felt the air grow heavier when the officer gently pushed her toward the patrol car. It was as if the entire world was witnessing her downfall, yet no one extended a hand to stop it. The car doors slammed shut with a hollow sound, cutting off her connection to the outside. The murmur of the crowd was left behind, replaced by the echo of her own rapid breathing. The policeman at the wheel spoke on the radio, announcing the transport. Luciana rested her head against the cold window, her mind drifting to the only thought that really mattered: her daughters. Who would take care of them? How would she explain what was happening? The car started moving, taking away the life she had known until that moment. Luciana felt something inside her break into irreparable pieces. Her daughters would wait for her that night, wondering why their mother hadn't returned. Sophia would try to stay strong. Clara would cling to the hope that it was all a misunderstanding. But Luciana knew the truth. Nothing would ever be the same. Luciana spent the night in a cold cell, with the echo of keys and footsteps resonating in the station's corridors. Her hands still bore the reddish marks of the cuffs, and her mind was a whirlwind of dark thoughts. She hadn't slept. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her daughters' faces waiting for her, wondering why she hadn't come home. The fear of what lay ahead was worse than any physical punishment. At dawn, they woke her roughly and forced her to stand. "Your hearing is today. Move it." The guard's voice was monotonous, devoid of emotion. For him, she was just another case file in a stack. Luciana felt panic seize her chest. Today? She hadn't even had the chance to speak with a lawyer or explain her side of the story. Everything was moving too fast, as if someone was eager to bury her before she could defend herself. On the way to the courthouse, handcuffed in the back of the van, she tried to remember if there was anyone she knew who could help her. But reality was cruel. She was alone. No one with enough influence would care about a single mother accused of theft. To the system, she was just another case, another pawn on the board of blind and corrupt justice. She bit her lip hard, fighting desperation. She had to stay strong. The vehicle stopped with a jolt. Luciana swallowed hard when the doors opened, and she saw the courthouse's imposing facade. They led her inside, flanked by 2 officers, as if she were a dangerous criminal. The gazes of those present bore into her, full of prejudice. No one saw a desperate mother. They saw only what Regina wanted them to see, a hopeless thief. Luciana was escorted into the courtroom, a large space with marble walls and an elevated bench where the judge watched everything with an impassive expression. It was a setting designed to intimidate, to remind defendants they were at the mercy of those in power. Luciana felt a knot in her throat when she saw Regina among the attendees, her back straight and her gaze utterly confident. She did not appear nervous, because she knew she had already won. The public defender assigned to Luciana rushed over, flipping through a file he seemed to have received just minutes before. He was a young man with pronounced dark circles and a suit that was too big for him. "We'll do our best, Ms. Luciana," he mumbled softly, not looking her in the eye. But his tone of voice had no conviction. He wasn't going to fight for her. He was just going to follow the protocol, do the bare minimum before the judge gave his verdict. The prosecutor stood up triumphantly and presented the facts with the certainty of someone who already has everything decided. He showed the security camera photos, emphasizing that Luciana had stolen merchandise, damaging the establishment's integrity. Regina, in her severest tone, spoke of her commitment to justice, insisting she could not allow her business to become a haven for thieves. Each of her words was received with nods, as if the truth didn't matter. When it was Luciana's turn, her lawyer cleared his throat and mumbled some words about her difficult financial situation. He tried to argue that she had only taken food destined for the trash, that she had no intention of stealing, but the judge didn't even look up from his papers. He wasn't listening. To him, Luciana was already guilty. It was just a question of deciding how harsh the punishment would be. Luciana felt despair wrap around her chest like a knot impossible to untie. She looked at the judge, seeking some trace of humanity on his face, but found only indifference. For him, she was nothing but a number in a file, another offender to be judged quickly. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but her voice was drowned out by helplessness. If her fate was already decided, what was the point in defending herself? Regina barely smiled when the judge gestured with his hand to end the hearing. There was no deliberation, no questions, not even an attempt to examine the facts fairly. This court finds the defendant guilty of theft and repeat offenses of dishonesty. The words were cold, spoken without emotion. Luciana felt the ground open beneath her feet. Repeat offenses. What were they talking about? Everything was staged, every piece of evidence, every testimony. Luciana's lawyer stood at once, stammering something about the disproportion of the sentence, but the judge didn't even let him speak. Luciana felt an unbearable chill down her spine when she heard the final ruling. The defendant is sentenced to death by execution in the electric chair. The world turned into a distant echo, a blur of voices and empty stares. Her entire body froze. Was it a bad dream? Could someone really die for a piece of bread meant for the trash? Luciana felt the courtroom fade around her. The sound of whispers, voices, the judge's gavel. Everything seemed muffled, like she was underwater. Her legs trembled, her breathing turned ragged, and vertigo made her sway. Death penalty. It couldn't be real. Not for this. Not for a piece of bread. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry, as if her body refused to accept what was happening. She looked around, seeking help, support, something to make her wake up from this nightmare. But all she found were cold faces, empty gazes. Even Ricardo, the only one who might feel some guilt, kept his head down, unable to meet her eyes. Regina, however, had a faint smile on her lips, as if everything was going exactly as planned. 2 guards approached her, grabbing her arms to escort her out of the room. Her hands were cold. Her legs wouldn't respond. She did not resist. What would be the point? Who would care if she screamed, cried, or begged for justice? It was all decided long before she entered that courtroom. The truth never mattered. As they took her from the room, she heard someone sobbing in the back. It wasn't her. It wasn't her lawyer. It was an older woman, a spectator, maybe a mother, who understood what it meant to take a woman's life just because the world had left her poor. But one tear in the crowd would change nothing. The sentence had been pronounced. The clock of her life was now ticking down its final seconds. The hallway leading to the cell seemed endless. Each step took her farther from the reality she knew, from the possibility of going home to her daughters, Sophia and Clara. Their names pounded in her mind like a relentless echo. How would anyone explain to them what was happening? Who would tell them their mother wouldn't come back? The thought tore her apart inside, but she had no strength left to cry. The fear was too great, too overwhelming. The guards pushed her into the cell and closed the door with a metallic clang. The sound of the lock was like a final seal on her fate. The cell was small, with a hard bed and a tiny window barely letting in any light. Luciana sank onto the mattress, feeling the weight of the sentence crush her chest. Her hands shook. She had never felt such loneliness in her life. Outside, the world kept turning as if nothing had changed. Cars passed by, people came and went. Life continued without her tragedy, meaning anything to anyone else. Would her story be forgotten in a few days? Would it just be a footnote in some legal report? She shut her eyes tightly, trying to block those thoughts, but despair clung to her soul with iron claws. The sound of footsteps made her look up. A guard had stopped in front of her cell, observing her with an inscrutable expression. "Your execution has been scheduled for 10 days from now." 10 days, not even a chance to appeal to prove her innocence. 10 days to say goodbye to life, to leave her daughters behind, to accept the unacceptable. And for the first time in a long while, Luciana felt hope slip through her fingers like sand. Sophia and Clara didn't fully understand what had happened. They only knew their mother hadn't come home, and that instead a group of strangers had taken them from their small apartment in the middle of the night. There were no explanations, just quick instructions, cold stares, and an empty promise. Everything will be fine. But nothing was fine. Nothing could be fine without their mother. They were driven in a dark car to a huge grey building with narrow windows and tall walls. The orphanage looked nothing like a home. There were no colors on the walls, no laughter, only a tense silence broken by the firm footsteps of the caregivers. The director, a tall and severe woman named Sister Constanza, greeted them with a harsh expression, as if their presence was more of a burden than a responsibility. "You must understand that there are rules here," she said, her voice sharp as she looked them up and down. "We are not a charity. If you're here, it's because your mother didn't know how to behave." Sophia felt a chill run down her spine. She was just a child, but even she understood that this woman had no intention of treating them with kindness. They were taken to a cold room with 2 narrow beds and scratchy sheets. Clara clung to her sister's arm, her eyes full of tears, but she did not dare cry out loud. She knew crying would do no good in that place. The doors slammed shut. And in the darkness, the two girls stayed huddled together, trying to cling to the only thing they still had, each other. Days in the orphanage passed with suffocating slowness. Every morning, a shrill whistle signaled wake-up time, followed by a strict routine that left no room for comfort. The girls were lined up in the dining hall like soldiers, forced to eat quickly and in silence. The food was tasteless, served on scratched metal plates, and there were no second portions, no matter how hungry they were. Sophia and Clara ate slowly, trying to make each bite last, though the emptiness in their stomachs never fully went away. Sister Constanza wasted no time making it clear that compassion did not exist in that place. She was a rigid woman, her face stone-like, and her hands bony, moving with clockwork precision. To her, the children were problems to be corrected, not souls in need of affection. "We don't want rebellious attitudes or unnecessary weaknesses here," she told them on the second day. "And even less from the daughters of criminals." Sophia felt anger burn in her chest, but she kept her head down. She knew that speaking up would only make things worse. The other girls at the orphanage were not kind either. Some were indifferent, too wrapped up in their own suffering to worry about the newcomers. Others, however, found in Sophia and Clara a fresh target for their frustration. "Is your mom a thief?" sneered an older one, a 10-year-old girl with sharp eyes. "That's probably why you're here, to learn to steal better." Clara shrank, feeling each word as a blow to the chest. That night, when the dorm lights were turned off, Clara broke down in tears for the first time. Sophia held her tightly, stroking her hair in the darkness, just as their mother used to do when they were afraid. "Mom will be back," she whispered, though she was not sure it was true. It was a fragile promise, held up only by the need to believe in something, to keep despair from settling in their hearts. Days passed in the endless monotony of punishment. The orphanage was no refuge but a prison disguised as a benevolent institution. Sophia tried to stay strong for her sister, but each day got harder. The caregivers' gazes were full of judgment, as if her very existence were a mistake, a burden no one wanted to bear. She knew she couldn't afford to cry. If she gave in to fear, Clara would collapse as well. The other girls continued their taunts, some whispering quietly, others in cruel murmurs. "I bet your mom's dead," said one of them as they folded their sheets in the dorm. "Thieves' orphans don't last long." Sophia gritted her teeth, feeling her anger simmer, but she didn't respond. She knew violence would only bring punishment, and the last thing she wanted was to give Sister Constanza a reason to separate them. Clara, on the other hand, became increasingly silent. She stopped talking to the other girls, stopped asking about her mother, stopped looking Sophia in the eye. She spent hours drawing in the corner of an old sheet of paper, shaky lines that barely formed figures. When Sophia asked what she was drawing, Clara only whispered, "Home." A home they no longer had, a life that had been snatched away without warning or mercy. One afternoon, while they were in the yard, Clara tripped over a stone and fell. Her knee got scraped, and blood stained her grey uniform. One of the caregivers saw it, but rather than help her, she made a gesture of annoyance. "Get up by yourself," she ordered coldly. "We don't cry here over silly things." Sophia felt a knot in her throat watching her sister swallow her pain, watching her bite her lip to keep from sobbing. That place was killing them slowly, not with blows, but with the cruelest indifference. The orphanage routine became an unending punishment. Each day the girls woke to the same whistle, followed the same rules, and endured the same contempt. No one comforted them when they had nightmares. No one hugged them when they missed their mother. Sophia quickly realized that in that place, the only way to survive was to become invisible. But Clara couldn't. She still hoped someone would be kind, that this was all a mistake that would soon be corrected. One night, after the dorm lights went out, Clara whispered in the darkness, "Sophia, does Mom know where we are?" Her voice trembled as if it hurt to ask. Sophia squeezed her eyes shut. She didn't want to lie, but she also couldn't tell her the truth, so she simply said, "Yes, she'll find us." But in her heart, doubt gnawed away. What if their mother never got out of prison? What if they never saw her again? Days passed, and despair settled in them bit by bit. But one afternoon, something changed. While helping clean Sister Constanza's office, Clara noticed a crumpled envelope among a pile of old papers. It was a document with the market's logo, the very one where their mother had worked. The little girl didn't know exactly what it meant, but something inside her told her it was important. Without being seen, she hid the paper under her skirt and pressed it to her chest. That night, while everyone slept, Clara showed the document to her sister. Sophia took it with trembling hands, struggling to read the faded ink. She didn't understand everything, but something immediately caught her attention. Altering expiration dates and embezzlement. Her eyes went wide. This paper could be important. It might be the key to helping their mother. Sophia's heart pounded as she read those words over and over. She didn't fully grasp their meaning, but something inside her said this document was crucial. If it talked about irregularities at the market where her mother worked, maybe someone could use it to prove everything had been a setup. Maybe her mother wasn't just innocent. Maybe someone had manipulated the situation to frame her. Clara watched her with wide, hopeful eyes. "Do you think this can help, Mom?" Sophia squeezed the paper in her hands and slowly nodded. "I think so, but I don't know how." In that moment, reality crashed over them like a storm. They were only children, with no one to turn to, trapped in a place where no one would listen. If they wanted to save their mother, they would have to find a way to do it themselves. That night, Sophia could barely sleep. She spent hours thinking about how to get out of that orphanage, how to find someone who truly wanted to help. She couldn't trust the caregivers or Sister Constanza, but there had to be another option. Then she remembered something. One of the market employees, Marina, had been kind to her mother. Maybe she would know what to do. When the first ray of sun crept through the window, Sophia already had a plan. It wouldn't be easy, but doing nothing wasn't an option. She knew her mother was in danger, and every minute counted. If no one else was going to save her, then she would do it. Sophia spent the day observing every detail of the orphanage. Schedules, shift changes, which doors were left unlocked, which exits were less guarded. She had no idea how, but she was determined to leave with her sister. She couldn't wait for someone else to do something. Her mother was in danger, and with each passing minute they got closer to losing her forever. Fear couldn't stop her. Clara, though scared, trusted her sister without question. She had learned that in that place, the only person she could trust was Sophia. "What if they catch us?" she asked in a trembling voice. Sophia looked her in the eye and for the first time in days smiled resolutely. "If they catch us, we'll try again." Because giving up was not an option. That night, when the orphanage lights went out and the caregivers made their final round, Sophia took Clara's hand and they slipped out of their beds. They moved silently, holding their breath, hearts pounding like drums in their chests. Every creak of the wooden floor made them pause, waiting to see if someone woke up. But the orphanage was old, and the adults trusted too much in locks and bars. They reached Sister Constanza's office. The door was locked, but Sophia had seen where they kept the keys. She reached out carefully, feeling the cold metal in her fingers. Clara watched her with eyes full of fear and excitement. With one last glance at the hall, Sophia turned the key in the lock, and the door opened with a faint click. They had done it. Now they just needed to find a way out. Sophia and Clara hurried through the dark corridors of the orphanage, feeling the cold air cling to their skin. Every shadow on the wall seemed like a guard about to catch them. Every distant sound made them hold their breath. They couldn't fail. Not now. Their mother needed them, and that document was the only chance to prove her innocence. The orphanage's back door was bolted, but Sophia had seen how the caregivers opened it during the day. She stood on tiptoe, feeling around the doorframe until she found the latch. Her heart pounded as she tried to move it quietly. Clara clung to her arm, eyes fixed on the darkness behind them. A dull clunk indicated the lock had released, and the door inched open. Their moment had come. As soon as they got out, they ran as fast as they could, never looking back. The orphanage sat on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by deserted streets and old buildings. They didn't know exactly where to go, but Sophia had a name in mind: Marina, her mother's former co-worker at the market. If anyone could help, it was her. All they had to do was find her before anyone noticed they were gone. After almost an hour of walking, their feet sore and cold gnawing at their hands, they found a phone booth. Sophia barely knew how to use it, but she remembered seeing her mother dial numbers before. She looked at the document Clara had taken and saw a contact number at the bottom. It was a risk, but they had no other choice. With trembling fingers, she dialed and waited. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, until someone answered. Sophia gripped the receiver with both hands, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. "Hello? Who is this?" The voice on the other end sounded tired, almost annoyed by the late call. Sophia swallowed hard and forced herself to speak, though her voice shook. "My name is Sophia. My mom is Luciana. She was arrested, but she's not guilty." There was silence. Then the voice changed tone. "Luciana, how did you get this number?" "We found a paper at the orphanage," Sophia quickly replied, looking at her sister, who watched her anxiously. "It has things written about the market, about fraud, and we think someone used it to accuse my mom." The line stayed completely silent for several seconds. Sophia feared the person would hang up, not believe her. But finally the man spoke in a different tone, sounding more alert. "Listen carefully, kid. You can't talk about this over the phone. Where are you?" Sophia looked around. They were on a dimly lit street with a couple of closed shops and the phone booth as their only shelter. "I don't know. I see a store with a green sign and a post with a flickering light." Clara clung to her arm, trembling with cold and fear. The voice on the phone sighed. "Stay there. Don't talk to anyone. I'm on my way." And then the line went dead. Sophia hung up the receiver with sweaty hands. They didn't know who that man was or if he could really help them, but they had no other option. They sat on the curb, huddled together, waiting in the darkness. Every minute felt like an eternity. They didn't know if they were about to be saved or if they'd just made the worst mistake of their lives. The night air was icy, and Sophia held Clara close to keep her warm. The street was almost deserted, except for the occasional car that drove by without stopping. Sophia tried to stay alert, but fear gnawed at her. They had run away from the orphanage, called a stranger, and now waited in the dark, not knowing if they had done the right thing. Clara said nothing, burying her face in her sister's shoulder as though she wanted to disappear. After what felt like forever, an old dusty car parked on the opposite side of the street. Sophia's heart raced when she saw a man quickly get out of the vehicle. He looked tired, his shirt wrinkled and his beard unkempt, but his expression was not anger, it was urgency. "Sophia?" he asked quietly, looking at both girls. Sophia nodded without moving. He glanced around, making sure no one else was watching. "I'm Miguel. Come with me. It's not safe here." His tone was firm but not aggressive. Sophia hesitated for a moment. Her mother had always told her not to talk to strangers, never to get in cars with unknown people. But this was not a normal moment. If there was a chance to save her mother, they had to take it. She took Clara's hand and crossed the street with her, climbing into the car with her heart in her throat. Miguel started the engine immediately, without asking questions. For the first few minutes the silence was absolute, only the noise of the motor filling the space. Finally the man sighed and looked at them in the rearview mirror. "I know who your mother is, and I know they're punishing her for something she didn't do. But this is bigger than you think. If you really want to help her, you're going to have to be brave." Sophia felt a chill run down her back, not because she was cold, but because Miguel's words made her understand it was more dangerous than she realized. It wasn't just a mistake, not just an injustice. It was something bigger, something dirty, something someone was desperate to keep hidden. She looked at Clara, who watched her with frightened eyes, and felt the responsibility fall on her shoulders like a slab. They couldn't back out. Miguel pulled out a packet of papers from the back seat and threw it onto the dashboard. "I've been investigating Regina for years," he said tensely. "She has connections with politicians, businessmen, judges. Your mother was just collateral damage. But this," he pointed to the wrinkled document Clara had stolen from the orphanage. "This might be the missing piece." Sophia looked at the papers, not fully understanding, but knowing they were important. "What does it mean?" she asked in a small voice. The journalist turned the wheel sharply as he took a tight curve, keeping his eyes on the road. "It means someone's been tampering with product expiration dates at the market, selling expired food at a low cost to then justify losses and evade taxes. And when your mother took that bread, Regina saw the perfect opportunity to blame her and shift the focus." Sophia felt a knot in her throat. Her mother wasn't just innocent. She had been used as a scapegoat. Miguel slammed the brakes and parked in a dark alley. He turned in his seat and looked at them seriously. "If we do this, there's no turning back. We can't fail. But I need to know if you're willing to fight for her." Sophia swallowed hard. She looked at her sister, at her own trembling hands, then thought of her mother, sentenced to death for a crime she didn't commit. She raised her head and met his gaze with determination. "Tell us what we have to do." Miguel wasted no time. He took out a notebook full of notes and opened it on the car's dashboard, showing newspaper clippings, underlined names, and confusing diagrams. "Listen, this isn't just about your mother. Regina has built an empire of corruption based on manipulation, bribes, and lies. And now, thanks to you, we have something that can bring her down." Sophia felt the weight of those words. They weren't just going to save her mother. They were going up against someone who would do anything to silence them. Clara squeezed her sister's hand nervously. "How can we help?" she asked in a trembling voice. Miguel sighed and took out his phone. "We're going to expose this. But publishing an article won't be enough. Justice here is already bought. We need to make it public before they can cover it up. We need evidence, witnesses, and most importantly, we need time." Sophia shuddered as she remembered the guard's words. "Your execution is scheduled for 10 days from now." 10 days. That was all they had to accomplish, the impossible. "What if we don't make it in time?" Miguel went quiet for a moment, as if he didn't want to answer, but Sophia already knew. If they failed, her mother would die. The journalist started the car and hit the gas. "First, we need to keep you off the radar. If Regina finds out you ran away, she'll look for you. And believe me, that woman leaves no loose ends." Sophia felt a tightness in her throat. It wasn't just about running. It was about surviving long enough to get justice, and every minute that went by was one less minute on her mother's clock. The car drove through the dark city streets, zigzagging between deserted avenues and hidden alleys. Miguel drove nervously, constantly checking the rearview mirror as if expecting a car to appear behind them any second. Sophia didn't fully grasp how danger worked in the adult world, but she knew they were at risk. Regina had money, power, and influence. If she wanted them gone, she would do it without hesitation. "Where are we going?" Clara asked in a weak voice, gripping the seat as if the car were a boat in the midst of a storm. Miguel kept his eyes on the road. "Somewhere safe. I have a contact who can help us make the evidence public. But first, we need to make sure no one's following us." Sophia pressed her lips together, unable to shake the image of her mother locked in that cell, waiting for an unjust death. Miguel made a quick phone call while driving. His tone was tense, his voice low, as if he didn't even want them to hear. "Yes, I have them. No, we can't wait. They're moving fast. I need you to get access to the files as soon as possible." There was silence. Then Miguel gritted his teeth. "Then find another way. If we don't do it now, there won't be a later." He hung up abruptly, cursing under his breath. Sophia gathered her courage and asked, "What's happening?" Miguel sighed and sped up. "Regina already knows you escaped." The words struck her like a blow to the chest. Sophia felt her skin crawl, and Clara shrank back in her seat. "That means they'll look for us. And if they find us before we publish the truth, We're done. The race against time had just become even more dangerous. Fear hung in the air like an invisible poison. Sophia felt her heart pounding, her mind trying to process what Miguel had just said. Regina knew they had escaped. That meant they were not only in danger themselves, but anyone who tried to help them was as well. She looked at Clara, crouched in her seat, her hands clenched in her lap. They couldn't afford to fail. Miguel took a sharp turn down a narrow alley, switching off the headlights and breathing deeply, as if trying to figure out his next move. Listen, this is bigger than you think. Regina controls judges, prosecutors, police. If they find us before we can make this public, we won't get a second chance. His voice was harsh, but not cruel. He was telling them the truth plainly. Sophia swallowed and leaned forward. You said you had someone who could help us. Who is it? Miguel looked at her in the rearview mirror, sizing her up for a moment. He's an old friend, a journalist who still believes in the truth. If we get him to publish this in a major outlet, Regina won't be able to cover it with money. Clara raised her head. Will that save Mum? She asked in a faint voice. The silence was long. Miguel ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. I don't know, he finally admitted. But if we don't try, her sentence will stand. And in a few days they'll execute her without anyone asking questions. Sophia felt a chill down her spine. They couldn't afford to hesitate. They couldn't wait any longer. Then let's go to that journalist, she said firmly. We have to do it now. Miguel nodded quickly and started the car again. The engine roared in the silent early morning, and the journalist maneuvered deftly to exit the alley without drawing attention. Sophia clung to her seat, breathing fast. Every minute that passed was one step closer to saving her mother or falling into Regina's trap. The uncertainty was unbearable, but they couldn't stop. We need to change cars, Miguel said, turning onto a side street with the headlights off. This is the one I use for my reporting, and if they're already looking for us, the first thing they'll do is trace my plates. Sophia nodded, not fully understanding but realizing it was necessary. Clara, for her part, crouched in her seat, clinging to the crumpled paper as if it were a shield. She didn't speak, but her eyes reflected a fear she couldn't put into words. After a few minutes of tense driving, Miguel stopped in front of an abandoned warehouse. He got out without a word and knocked on the metal door in a rhythmic pattern. Sophia leaned forward to get a better look. The door opened slowly, and a figure appeared in the darkness, an older man with graying hair and thick glasses, who looked at Miguel distrustfully before resting his gaze on the girls. Are these them? Yes, Miguel replied without hesitation. There's no time. We need a car and a safe place. Regina already knows they escaped. The man sighed and looked around before motioning them in. Come in quickly. They shouldn't see you here. Sophia took Clara's hand, and together they crossed the metal doorway. In that moment, she knew there was no turning back. The warehouse was dark and cold, the air tinged with dust and old oil. Flickering lights provided just enough illumination to reveal piles of boxes and scattered tools. Sophia felt the place had a clandestine vibe, like an improvised refuge for people who couldn't trust anyone. Clara still clung to her arm, trembling not from cold, but from fear. The man with thick glasses examined them closely. I'm Ernesto, he said plainly. Miguel told me about you. I know you need help, but what you're trying to do is insane. Sophia pressed her lips together. Everything they had done so far had been insane. Escaping the orphanage, crossing the city at night, trusting strangers. But if that was what it took to save her mother, she would keep going. Miguel folded his arms and looked at Ernesto impatiently. We know Regina is behind all this. We know she forged the evidence and that my report wasn't enough to bring her down. He turned to the girls and indicated the document Clara was still holding. But now we have this. It's the proof we needed. Ernesto bent down to take it, studying it with a frown. If what you say is true, this not only proves her corruption, it directly ties her to fraud and tampering with sentences. Sophia felt hope grow in her chest, But Ernesto quickly brought her back to reality. If we publish this, she'll do whatever it takes to silence us. She's not just a businesswoman with money. She has real power, the kind that can make people disappear. Miguel exhaled heavily and looked at the girls. That's why there's no margin for error. If we want to save Luciana, we have to move right now. And for the first time in that whole nightmare, Sophia felt that maybe, just maybe, there was a real chance to change everything. Luciana sat on the cold floor of her cell, her back against the concrete wall. She had lost track of time. She didn't know if it was day or night, whether hours or days had passed since they last brought her food. But none of that mattered. Her fate was sealed. In a matter of days, she would be executed for a crime she didn't commit. Her daughters would never understand why their mother hadn't come home. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. The cell door opened, and two impassive-faced guards entered. "Get up," one of them ordered. Luciana didn't ask why. She had learned that in that place, questions did no good. She got up slowly, feeling her body stiff. Fear pressed on her chest like a weight, crushing her without relief. They escorted her down a hallway, lit by fluorescent lights, each step marking her destiny. They weren't taking her to the execution room, not yet. They took her to a small office where an official waited with some papers in his hand. "Your execution has been moved up," he said, without looking her in the eye. Luciana felt a chill run down her spine. It will be in less than 24 hours. The news slapped her like a blow. There was no time, no hope, no way out. Her breathing quickened, but she said nothing. There was no one to beg, no one who would listen to her truth. It was all planned out. They wanted to silence her before something went wrong. And somewhere beyond those walls, her daughters were alone. If she died, they would never see her again. Sophia and Clara couldn't have known it, but every second they spent in that warehouse meant one less second to save their mother. Miguel and Ernesto were discussing a rushed plan, with maps and papers spread out over a metal table. Sophia tried to follow their conversation, but the words blurred in a storm of anxiety. The only thing that truly mattered was reaching the courthouse before it was too late. "If we publish the story now, it won't do any good," Ernesto said, slamming his fist on the table in frustration. "Regina will control the narrative, call her contacts, and make it all vanish before it reaches the judges." Miguel gritted his teeth. "Then we have to make the news explode, make it impossible to hide." Sophia leaned forward. "How do we do that?" Miguel looked at her seriously. "With you." Sophia's breath caught for a moment. "If the girls go public with the evidence, if they speak on camera live, it will be impossible to ignore them." Ernesto nodded. "We can get them in front of the press at the courthouse. If we get the story out before Luciana is executed, we'll force the authorities to intervene." Sophia felt a chill down her spine. Going public meant Regina would also know where they were, but if they didn't do it, her mother would die. She took a deep breath, took Clara's hand, and squeezed it tight. "Let's do it." There were no more doubts, no more fears. They only had one shot, and they were going to take it. The car sped through the city with the headlights off, gliding through empty streets like a fugitive shadow. Miguel drove with his jaw set, knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel. Ernesto, in the passenger seat, tapped furiously at his phone. "I contacted 2 journalists. They'll meet us at the courthouse entrance." Sophia bit her lip, feeling the weight of the situation on her shoulders. Only one chance. If they failed, her mother would die. Clara was silent, her small hand clutched in her sister's. Sophia could feel her trembling, fear pent up in her tiny frame. "It'll be okay," she whispered, though she wasn't sure. Regina was too powerful, had too many allies in the justice system and the police. But they had the truth, and this time, the world would listen. Suddenly, Miguel made a sharp turn into a dark alley. "Something's not right," he muttered, looking in the rearview mirror. Ernesto looked up from his phone. "Are they following us?" Miguel nodded briskly. 2 black cars. They showed up 2 blocks ago and haven't changed their route. Sophia felt her stomach clench. They didn't need to see the plates to know it was Regina who had found them. "If they catch us, it's over," Ernesto said tensely. Miguel floored the accelerator, and the car roared out of the alley. Sofia held Clara tightly as the speed increased. They couldn't be caught, not now. The courthouse was close, but the question was, would they make it before they were stopped? The engine roared as Miguel wove through the streets, trying to lose the cars following them. Sofia looked out the back window and saw lights drawing nearer. There was no doubt they were after them and wouldn't stop until they were sure they would never reach the courthouse. Ernesto clutched his phone, dialing frantically. "I'm going to warn the press that we've been intercepted. If we make noise, Regina won't be able to act so easily." The car took a sharp curve and skidded on the wet asphalt. Clara let out a choked scream and clung to her seat, eyes wide with fear. Sofia's own heart pounded against her chest, but she couldn't afford to panic. Only a few more minutes to reach the courthouse. If they failed her mother, there was no other option. They had to succeed. A loud thud shook the car. One of Regina's vehicles had caught up and rammed them from the side. Miguel swore and jerked the wheel to keep control. "Don't let them box us in!" Ernesto shouted. The courthouse was in sight, but if they were caught before crossing the security gates, everything would have been for nothing. Sofia saw the courthouse gates just ahead. There were television cameras, journalists, and several police officers at the entrance. "There it is!" she shouted, pointing with her finger. It was their only chance. If they got past the press barrier, Regina couldn't stop them without revealing her corruption to the world. Miguel hit the gas, and the car lurched with the force of its final burst. It was now or never. Miguel's car raced across the avenue, dodging the last few vehicles before reaching the courthouse. The black cars chasing them didn't slow down, but the sound of police sirens and the glare of TV cameras made them hesitate. In that instant, Sofia realized they were putting everything on the line in a single move. Reveal the truth before being caught. Miguel slammed on the brakes in front of the crowd of journalists, and Ernesto jumped out first, waving documents in the air. "We have proof of Regina's corruption!" he shouted loudly, his voice amplified by the microphones raised around him. Cameras turned on them at once, and flashes lit the scene like lightning in a thunderstorm. Sofia felt her breath catch, but she couldn't stop. She grabbed Clara's hand and ran toward the crowd. The girls pushed through the reporters until they stood before the microphones. "Our mom is innocent," Sofia shouted, her voice trembling yet strong. "They're killing her for something she didn't do. Regina set her up." The journalists, stunned by the statement, began asking questions, and the live broadcast descended into chaos. In the distance, Sofia saw Regina's men stop. They couldn't act without being seen. From the courthouse entrance, a policeman pressed his radio to his ear, hearing the news from the prison. "Someone verify Luciana's execution," an officer shouted, running inside. In that moment, hope flared in Sofia's chest. They had done the impossible. The truth could no longer be silenced, but the most important thing remained, stopping the execution before it was too late. Chaos took over the courthouse. Journalists jostled for a better shot. Police officers spoke into radios with tense faces, and reporters fired questions like bullets into the darkness. Sofia and Clara could barely process what was happening, but they knew they were no longer alone. For the first time, someone was listening to them. Miguel and Ernesto handed over the documents to a group of reporters, pointing out the details tying Regina to fraud, tampering with evidence, and judicial corruption. "This proves Luciana was used as a scapegoat," Ernesto said firmly. "The sentence against her was rigged from the start." A journalist looked up, voice filled with outrage. "If this is true, the justice system just sentenced an innocent woman to death." The impact of the news spread like wildfire. TV hosts interrupted their programs to air the story live. In a matter of minutes, public opinion began to shift. Regina, previously untouchable, watched her image as a righteous, powerful woman crumble. But the most urgent matter remained, stopping the execution before it was too late. An officer rushed out of the courthouse, phone pressed to his ear. "We need an immediate order to stop Luciana Mendoza's execution," he shouted, running to a squad car. But the clock wasn't stopping, and Sophia knew it. Her mother's life depended on them arriving in time. And Regina, somewhere, was surely making her own moves to save herself. Inside the prison, the atmosphere was thick, laden with crushing tension. Luciana stood, her wrists bound with leather straps as guards escorted her down the hall. Her footsteps echoed on the concrete floor, each echo marking one beat closer to her end. She didn't understand why the execution had been moved up, but she knew it wasn't a coincidence. Someone wanted her gone as soon as possible. When they reached the execution chamber, everything was set up. The electric chair in the center, witnesses behind glass, and the oppressive silence heralding the inevitable. Luciana took a deep breath, feeling her chest tremble. She wasn't afraid to die, but the thought of Sophia and Clara alone and defenseless in a world that had already taken too much from them pained her. She closed her eyes. There was no more fighting, no more hope. But suddenly, the doors burst open. A guard ran in, panic etched on his face, radio clutched to his ear. "Stop! There's an immediate suspension order for the execution." The executioner, who was about to attach the electrodes, halted in his tracks. The entire chamber fell into absolute silence. A hush followed, then an uproar of voices demanding explanations. Luciana felt her heart stop for a second. Had she heard correctly? Her body was still tense, waiting for the inevitable pain. But suddenly, everything changed. Another guard entered, confirming the order. The execution was suspended. The story had come to light. Someone, somewhere, had fought for her. And suddenly, amid the panic and confusion, hope bloomed again. The execution room became a whirlwind of chaos. Some officers whispered among themselves, unsure how to proceed, while others tried contacting their superiors. The executioner, still holding the electrodes, looked at the guards for instructions. Luciana felt her legs give way. The tension in her body demanded release in tears, but she forced herself to remain steady. She had learned life gave her no respite, and until they actually let her go, everything could still change in an instant. One of the higher-ranking officers took the radio, speaking in a clipped tone. "Confirm the order. I need official authorization to stop the execution." Luciana felt a shiver on hearing that. She still wasn't safe. There was still a chance everything could collapse in a matter of minutes. The witnesses behind the glass remained in their seats, confused, waiting for an outcome. But fate seemed to have shifted. Outside, at the prison, sirens blared as they approached. Several squad cars and press vehicles arrived simultaneously, and amid the throng, two little girls pushed through the crowd, shouting as loud as they could. "Our mom is innocent!" Sophia cried, tears in her eyes gripping Clara's hand. Reporters captured every image, every word, broadcasting it live across the country. There was no way to hide the truth anymore. The commotion intensified until an official appeared, clutching a document in his hand. "Stop everything! The execution order has been revoked. Luciana Mendoza must be released immediately." His words thundered through the chamber. Some witnesses sighed with relief. Others were simply shocked. Luciana, still strapped in, felt her heart resume beating. For the first time, she had a chance at life. The news spread like wildfire. Television cameras broadcast live the exact moment Luciana's execution was halted, and the entire country witnessed the truth as it began to emerge. On social media, headlines erupted with phrases like "innocent mother sentenced to death" and "judicial corruption exposed." Regina, the untouchable woman, was about to fall. Inside the chamber, the guards hurried to unstrap Luciana. Her body was stiff, not from fear, but from the disbelief that still kept her from breathing normally. Was this real? Was she really alive? As soon as she felt her wrists freed, she brought her hands to her face and let out a stifled sob. She had no idea how, but someone had stopped the injustice. Outside, Sophia and Clara were still surrounded by cameras and microphones. The flash of lights illuminated their tired faces, but their voices did not waver. "Our mom is not guilty," Sophia repeated firmly, still holding her sister's hand. "We want to see her. We demand to see her." And the public, the entire country, listened. All eyes in the nation were on them. Regina had no escape. At the courthouse, Judge Morales received the documents proving Regina's fraud. His face hardened as he saw the signatures, the altered data, the blatant rigging of sentences. "This is unacceptable," he muttered. Then he raised his head and looked at the officers. "Find Regina, issue a warrant for her immediate arrest." And with that order, the empire of corruption that had protected Regina for years began to collapse. Regina was in her private office when the story broke on every channel. Television screens showed live coverage of Luciana's execution being suspended, and headlines shouted her name as the face of corruption. Her phone rang incessantly, lawyers, allies, nervous politicians asking what to do. But for the first time in years, Regina had no answers. She stood up, jaw tight, grabbing her purse with the intention of disappearing before it was too late. She knew how the game worked. When the press and public opinion turned against you, there was no salvation. But before she could take 2 steps toward the door, it burst open. Several officers came in with their weapons raised. "Regina Salazar, you are under arrest for corruption, tampering with evidence and abuse of power." Regina tried to smile, to maintain composure, but sweat on her forehead gave her away. "This is a mistake. It's all a setup." Her voice was firm, but her hands shook. No one was listening. No one believed her. The woman who had built an untouchable empire was now in handcuffs before the cameras, while the entire country celebrated her downfall. Her time was up. Back at the prison, Luciana's cell door was thrown open wide. Officers escorted her outside, where the sunlight struck her face for the first time in weeks. And then she saw them. Sophia and Clara were there, waiting. The look on her daughter's faces, brimming with tears and hope, was all she needed to break down weeping. They ran to her and wrapped her in a desperate embrace, an embrace that conveyed everything words could not. The air of freedom felt different, lighter, purer. Luciana walked hand in hand with her daughters, feeling the warmth of their small fingers clinging to hers, as if they feared this was all a dream they might wake from at any moment. But it wasn't. It was real. After so much suffering, after feeling buried alive in despair, she stood there upright with Sophia and Clara holding her as if they would never let go. All around them, reporters were still trying to get statements, but Miguel and Ernesto kept them at a distance. Luciana didn't want to talk, not yet. She didn't have the strength to relive everything that had happened, to explain what it was like to watch the clock count down to her death with nothing she could do. The only thing she wanted in that moment was to hold her daughters and remember what it felt like to be alive, because for a long time she believed she would never have that chance again. Clara buried her face in her mother's chest and sobbed. "I thought we would never see you again." Luciana held her tighter, stroking her hair lovingly. "I never stopped thinking about you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never lost hope, but that was a lie. There were moments when she felt lost, when despair consumed her entirely. And if it weren't for her daughters, for their courage, she wouldn't be standing there now." Sophia pulled back a bit and looked at her mother with determined eyes. "We never stopped fighting either." And Luciana felt a pang in her chest. They had grown up so much in such a short time. Her daughters were no longer the little girls she'd left behind. The world had forced them to be brave, and though it pained her, it also filled her heart with pride. Luciana felt her legs falter, not from weakness, but from the weight of all she had endured. But this time it wasn't the exhaustion of despair, but the overwhelming realization that her story hadn't ended in tragedy. The world that had unjustly condemned her was now watching with interest, waiting for her to say something, to explain the inexplicable. But she just wanted to breathe, just wanted to hold her daughters and feel them, real and safe. Miguel and Ernesto approached discreetly, giving them space but sharing their relief. They too had fought, betting everything on a truth that no one wanted to hear. And now they were there, seeing that justice, though slow, could still exist. Miguel offered her a small smile. The whole country saw what happened, Luciana. No one can hush it up now. But she only nodded, because there was a truth no one else could understand. Prison had broken her. The execution had destroyed her, and though she was alive, the scars would not easily fade. Sofia looked at Miguel, tears still in her eyes. "Thank you for helping us." Her voice was small but steady, charged with a maturity beyond her years. Clara nodded, clinging tightly to her mother's arm, as if afraid everything would vanish. Miguel sighed, scratching the back of his neck, as though he wasn't used to thanks. "You were the ones who did the impossible. I just put the pieces in place." Camera flashes still went off around them, reporters pressing with questions Luciana had no strength left to answer. The world wanted details, wanted a scandal, but she just wanted to disappear with her daughters and start over. Ernesto noticed and spoke for her. "Luciana won't be making any statements today. Give her some space." And for the first time in a long while, someone was protecting her instead of condemning her. It was time to leave the pain behind and begin to rebuild. The streets were packed with people, but Luciana only saw her daughters. The world around her kept spinning as if all she had been through was just a passing story for everyone else. But for her, nothing would ever be the same. Prison, humiliation, the fear of death, all of it had marked her in ways she still didn't understand. And yet, here she was with Sofia and Clara, breathing fresh air instead of farewells. Miguel led them to a discreet car parked near the courthouse. "You need rest? No one will bother you where we're going." Luciana nodded without questioning. She trusted him, Ernesto, and those who had bet on the truth when no one else did. But above all, she trusted her daughters. They had been her strength, her salvation. Without Sofia and Clara, she'd be dead. They got into the car and, for the first time in weeks, Luciana leaned her head back and closed her eyes. The adrenaline still coursed through her, but now there was something else alongside it. Relief. Not because everything was solved, but because she still had a chance. The future was still uncertain, life difficult, the wounds deep, but she was alive, and that changed everything. Sofia stared out the window, her brow still furrowed in thought. "Do you think Regina will go to prison?" she asked, without turning. Miguel snorted. "With everything we've exposed, there's no way she can get out of this." Luciana said nothing. She knew justice doesn't always punish the powerful, but now at least the world knew the truth. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to ensure no one else suffered what she did. The car moved through the city's bright streets, but Luciana barely noticed. Her thoughts were elsewhere, trapped in each moment of suffering. In each instant, she thought she'd never see her daughters again. She looked at Sofia and Clara, now asleep in the back seat. Their faces relaxed for the first time in a long while. That was her only solace. They had survived. Miguel parked at a small apartment on the outskirts of town, far from reporters and the media spotlight. "It's safe. You can rest here without anyone bothering you." Ernesto got out first, checking the place before giving them the go-ahead. Luciana carried Clara, who was still sound asleep, and Sofia followed quietly. Their bodies were exhausted, but their minds were still stuck in the day's chaos. Inside, the apartment was simple but welcoming. It had no luxuries, but it had something Luciana hadn't felt in weeks: tranquility. She sighed and sank into the couch, feeling her body finally succumb to exhaustion. She had spent too long on edge, fighting to survive, to keep hope alive. And now, for the first time in a long while, she could close her eyes without fearing she wouldn't wake up. Miguel sat in a chair across from her, watching silently before speaking. "Your story has changed a lot of things, Luciana, but now another battle begins." She looked at him wearily, but was not surprised. She knew this wasn't over. Regina might have fallen, But the system that protected her still existed, and now that she had her freedom again, she wouldn't let anyone else go through what she did. Luciana felt the weight of Miguel's words, but did not reply immediately. Her eyes rested on Sofia and Clara, sleeping soundly on a small bed, clinging to each other as if they still feared being lost. Everything she had done, everything she had endured, was for them. And now that the nightmare was over, a new struggle was about to begin. She sighed and ran her hand over her face. "I don't want revenge, Miguel. I just want to make sure no one else goes through this." Her voice was firm, though her body still trembled with fatigue. She had lived through the worst injustice, but she didn't want to be consumed by hatred. All she wanted was justice, not just for herself, but for all those who had been silenced, for mothers who had been condemned without anyone fighting for them. Miguel nodded, as though he had expected that answer. "You don't have to decide anything now," he said, resting his elbows on his knees. "But when you're ready, when you feel you want to do something with what you've lived through, I'll be here." Luciana looked at him gratefully. It was strange to think that someone who until recently was a stranger had risked so much for her and her daughters. But that's how life is. Sometimes help comes from where you least expect it. She stood slowly and walked over to the window. The city was calm, the world still spinning, indifferent to what had happened. But she knew something inside her had changed forever. She wasn't the same woman she'd been before that cell, before that unjust trial, before her world collapsed. Now she had something fear could not take from her, a new opportunity. Luciana woke with the first rays of the sun filtering through the window. For a moment, her mind was still trapped in that cold cell, in the electric chair, in the fear of never seeing her daughters again. But when she turned her head and saw Sofia and Clara asleep by her side, breathing peacefully, she understood that everything had changed. She was alive. She had survived. She got up carefully, not wanting to wake them, and walked to the small kitchen in the apartment. The aroma of coffee filled the air, and Miguel was there, reading a newspaper with her story on the front page. Regina behind bars, the fall of an untouchable woman. The letters were huge, the impact undeniable. Luciana sat across from him, running her fingers along the table as if she still couldn't believe she was there, free. Miguel handed her a cup of coffee without saying a word. He didn't need to. They both knew the worst had passed, but they also knew the world doesn't change overnight. Regina had fallen, yes, but the system protecting her was still there, ready to create new executioners, new injustices, new victims. Luciana knew that better than anyone. She had experienced firsthand what it means to be disposable to those in power. Sofia appeared in the kitchen doorway, Clara clinging to her hand. Their eyes still showed the fear of the past days, but also something else. Hope. "Are we going to be okay, Mom?" she asked in a whisper. Luciana crouched down to their level and gently stroked their faces. "Yes, my love, we'll be okay." And this time, she wasn't saying it just to reassure them. She believed it, because after all they had gone through, they knew that together they could overcome anything.